The Arizona Territory, 1878. What started as a simple water stop nearly cost Thomas McKenna his life and changed everything he thought he knew about honor, survival, and love. When the exhausted cattle rancher stumbled upon a hidden stream in Apache territory, he never expected to find Aiyana, daughter of a war chief, bathing in the sacred waters. Her fury was immediate and absolute. According to tribal law, he had dishonored her, and now only two paths remained: marriage or death at the hands of her warrior brothers. Neither Thomas nor Aiyana wanted this fate, but as they fled together across the unforgiving desert, something unexpected began to bloom between sworn enemies. She taught him the language of the land. He showed her that not all white men were destroyers. But with her brothers closing in and the cavalry hunting Apache, could two people from warring worlds forge a love strong enough to survive? Will their forced union become the key to peace between their peoples, or will it destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas McKenna had always believed that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle the Arizona Territory threw at him. Standing on the porch of his weathered ranch house at dawn, coffee steaming in the cool morning air, he surveyed the harsh landscape that had been his battleground for the past 5 years. The McKenna Ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of stubborn desert, where cattle grazed on sparse grass, and survival meant understanding every subtle shift in weather, every dangerous creature that called this wilderness home. Thomas had inherited more than land from his father. He'd inherited a legacy of conflict that weighed heavier than the cavalry saber hanging above his fireplace. Colonel James McKenna had served with distinction in the Indian Wars, leading cavalry charges against Apache raiders who struck settlements throughout the territory. The ornate saber, its brass handle worn smooth by his father's grip, bore witness to battles that had shaped the frontier. But it also carried the burden of choices Thomas struggled to understand. His father had died believing the Apache were savages who needed to be driven from the land or destroyed. Thomas had grown up on stories of Apache raids, of families slaughtered in their sleep, of children taken and never returned. The saber represented justice to his father, but to Thomas it increasingly felt like a symbol of endless, senseless violence. The ranch itself told the story of this ongoing conflict. Bullet holes still scarred the barn walls from an attack 3 years ago. The cemetery on the hill held not just his parents, but 2 ranch hands killed defending the cattle. Every morning Thomas counted his livestock, knowing that Apache raiders might take what they needed to survive, leaving him to face another harsh winter with dwindling resources. Yet something in Thomas resisted the simple hatred his father had embraced. During his rare trips to Tucson for supplies, he'd seen Apache families trading peacefully, children playing while their mothers bartered for goods. These glimpses of ordinary life conflicted with the savage raiders of his father's stories. The contradiction haunted him as he struggled to keep the ranch profitable. Cattle prices remained low, water was scarce, and the constant threat of raids made it difficult to hire reliable help. Most days, Thomas worked alone, moving herds between grazing areas, repairing fences, and maintaining the equipment that kept his small operation running. His nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, lived 15 miles south and had given up trying to ranch in Apache territory. They'd moved to Tucson last spring, selling their land for a fraction of its value. "Ain't worth dying for," Henderson had said as he loaded his wagon. "Let the army deal with the Apache. I'm done." But Thomas couldn't give up. This land held his family's blood, his father's dreams, and his own stubborn hope for a different future. He'd seen enough violence to know it solved nothing. Every raid led to retaliation, every retaliation to more raids. Someone had to break the cycle, though he had no idea how. The morning he decided to scout new water sources along the northern boundary, Thomas carried his father's field glasses and a hope that he might find a spring or stream to supplement his dwindling wells. The summer had been brutal, and his cattle needed water more than they needed his protection from raiders. He rode Dusty, a sturdy quarter horse, with the patience and endurance necessary for desert travel. The gelding had been his father's mount, steady and reliable, with an instinct for dangerous ground that had saved Thomas more than once. As they climbed into the rocky hills that marked the edge of Apache territory, Thomas felt the familiar tension that came with entering disputed land. His Winchester rifle rested easy in its scabbard, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. Violence had taken too much from his family already. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace that tested man and horse alike. Thomas followed game trails and dry washes, reading the land the way his father had taught him, looking for signs of water in a landscape that hoarded its secrets jealously. By midday, the heat forced him to seek shade in a narrow canyon where ancient rocks rose like cathedral walls. Dusty's ears pricked forward, and Thomas heard it too, the gentle sound of running water, precious as silver in this harsh country. Following the sound deeper into the canyon, Thomas felt his spirits lift. A reliable water source could change everything for his ranch, perhaps even allow him to expand his herd. The future suddenly seemed brighter as he dismounted and led Dusty toward the promise of cool, clear water. He had no way of knowing that this moment of hope would change his life forever, or that the sacred stream ahead held more than water. It held his destiny. In the hidden valleys of the Dragoon Mountains, where her people had sought refuge from the relentless advance of white settlers, Aiyana moved with the quiet grace of someone born to this harsh land. The daughter of War Chief Nalish, she carried herself with the dignity befitting her station, but it was her gift as a healer that truly defined her place among the Chiricahua Apache. The leather medicine pouch at her side contained more than herbs and sacred stones. It held the accumulated wisdom of generations. Her grandmother had taught her to read the language of plants, to understand which roots eased pain, which leaves reduced fever, and which combinations could draw poison from wounds. The small deerskin bag, decorated with turquoise beads and blessed by the medicine man, represented her connection to the spiritual world that guided her people. At 23, Aiyana had already earned respect as both healer and counselor. Warriors sought her skills after battles, mothers brought sick children to her wickiup, and elders valued her judgment in matters requiring both practical knowledge and spiritual insight. She moved between worlds with ease, the physical realm of broken bones and infected wounds, and the spirit realm where true healing began. Her name meant eternal blossom, given to her because she had been born during the spring, when the desert bloomed with unusual abundance. The prophecy said she would bring life where others saw only death, hope where others found despair. Her father, though proud of her abilities, worried that her compassionate nature made her vulnerable in a world increasingly dominated by violence. The Apache way of life was under constant threat. White settlers claimed more land each year. The army pursued her people relentlessly, and resources became scarcer as traditional hunting grounds were lost to ranchers and miners. Many of her father's warriors spoke of war as the only solution, but Aiyana had seen enough death to know that violence begot only more violence. She had learned some English from a captured missionary who lived among them for 2 seasons before escaping. The man had been kind, despite his fear, and had taught her not just his language but glimpses of his people's way of thinking. This knowledge troubled some tribal members, who saw any understanding of white culture as betrayal, but Aiyana believed knowledge was power, and power could be used for protection. Her morning ritual took her to the sacred stream, where her grandmother had once taught her to listen to the water spirits. The hidden spring, known only to a few tribal members, flowed from deep within the earth, and was said to hold healing properties. Here, Aiyana came to pray, to gather certain plants that grew only in this blessed place, and to cleanse herself in waters that connected her to countless generations of her people. The stream lay in a natural cathedral of red stone, where ancient pictographs told stories of her ancestors. Her grandmother had explained each symbol, the spiral representing life's journey, the handprints marking those who had passed this way, the animals that shared the desert with the people. This place held the memory of her tribe, their connection to the land that white men saw only as property to be claimed. As she prepared for her morning prayers, removing her duskin dress and moccasins, Aiyana felt the presence of the spirits who dwelt in this sacred place. The water ran clear and cold, fed by underground springs that had flowed since the beginning of time. She entered the stream slowly, respectfully, feeling the blessing of the water against her skin. This ritual cleansing prepared her for the healing work that awaited. 3 warriors had been wounded in a skirmish with cavalry patrols, and an elder suffered from the wasting sickness that required careful tending. Her medicine pouch contained what she needed, but the spiritual preparation was equally important. Healing began with understanding the balance between all living things. The desert morning surrounded her with its ancient song, the call of coyotes in distant canyons, the whisper of wind through stone arches, the gentle splash of sacred water over smooth rocks. For these precious moments, she could forget the growing pressure on her people, the constant danger, the difficult choices that lay ahead. Aiyana had no way of knowing that this morning's sacred ritual would be interrupted by a stranger whose presence would change everything, not just for herself, but for both their peoples. As she emerged from the healing waters, droplets catching the early sunlight like scattered diamonds, she felt only the peace that came from connecting with the eternal rhythm of the land. The sound of splashing water drew Thomas through the narrow canyon passage like a man dying of thirst. Dusty's hooves clicked against the stone path as they rounded the final bend, and Thomas felt his heart lift at the sight of clear water flowing over ancient rocks. The stream was more beautiful than he had dared hope, deep enough for his cattle, pure enough to drink, and apparently permanent. He dismounted quickly, already planning how he would bring his herd here, when movement in the water stopped him cold. A woman rose from the stream like a vision from another world, water cascading from her bronze skin in the golden morning light. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Thomas stood frozen, unable to look away from the natural grace of her movements. Then reality crashed over him like a physical blow. This was an Apache woman, and he was trespassing on sacred ground. Worse, he had violated something profoundly private, sacred in ways his white man's understanding could barely comprehend. The woman's eyes met his across the water, and Thomas saw shock transform into fury with terrifying swiftness. She was beautiful in a way that took his breath away, high cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to hold the depth of desert nights, and a bearing that spoke of nobility even in her vulnerable state. "Inde, Yulna Goji," she shouted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Thomas didn't understand the Apache words, but her tone needed no translation. He raised his hands, trying to show he meant no harm, but she was already moving, reaching for her clothes with swift, angry movements. "I'm sorry," he called out, his voice cracking like a schoolboy's. "I didn't know. I was just looking for water." She pulled on her duskin dress with quick, efficient movements, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When she spoke again, it was in accented but clear English that surprised him. "You have seen what no man outside my family should see. You have violated sacred waters and brought dishonor upon me." Around her neck, Thomas noticed an elaborate headdress of eagle feathers hanging from a leather cord, some kind of ceremonial item that spoke of high status among her people. The feathers caught the light as she moved, creating patterns that seemed to dance with her anger. "I truly didn't know," Thomas said, taking a step backward. "I'll leave immediately. I won't tell anyone about this place." "Leave?" Her laugh held no humor. "You think you can simply walk away from what you have done?" Thomas felt the first stirring of real fear. He had heard stories of what Apache did to trespassers, especially those who violated their sacred places. His hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but something in her eyes stopped him. This wasn't just anger, it was pain, humiliation, and something deeper he couldn't name. "Among my people," she continued, her voice steady but vibrating with emotion, "when a man sees a woman as you have seen me, honor demands consequences. Either he must take her as his wife, or her family must restore honor through blood. Marriage." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "But we don't even know each other." "Know each other?" She stepped closer, and he could see the intricate beadwork on her dress, the careful craftsmanship that spoke of hours of patient work. "You know my body as only a husband should. That knowledge cannot be taken back." Thomas felt the world tilting around him. This morning he had been a simple rancher looking for water. Now he stood facing a choice between marriage to an Apache woman or death at the hands of her warriors. "I am Aiyana, daughter of War Chief Nalnish. These are our sacred waters, blessed by spirits you do not understand. Your presence here, seeing me in ritual cleansing, has broken laws older than your people's presence in this land. My name is Thomas McKenna," he said, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "I swear to you, I meant no disrespect." "Intent matters little now," Aiyana replied, her fingers touching the eagle feather headdress at her throat. The dishonor exists. It must be answered. In the distance, a sound made them both freeze, the call of a hunting horn, unmistakably Apache. Aiyana's face went pale beneath her bronze skin. "My brothers," she whispered, "they hunt nearby. If they find you here, find us together like this, they will not wait for explanations." Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "What do we do?" For the first time since their eyes had met, Aiyana looked uncertain. The proud daughter of a war chief suddenly seemed very young, very vulnerable. "We run," she said simply, "together. Because now, whether we choose it or not, our fates are bound." The hunting horn sounded again, closer this time, and Aiyana's face hardened with grim determination. She moved with swift efficiency, gathering her belongings, while Thomas stood paralyzed by the magnitude of what was happening. "Your horse," she said urgently, "can he carry two?" "Yes, but no questions. My brothers Kozan and Delshe are the finest trackers among our people. If they find us here together, they will kill you immediately and drag me back in shame." Thomas helped her onto Dusty behind him, acutely aware of her warm presence against his back. The horse snorted nervously, sensing the tension, but responded to Thomas's steady hands on the reins. "Which way?" he asked, though every direction seemed to lead deeper into Apache territory. "North, toward the Badlands. The ground is harder there. We can lose them among the rocks." As they rode away from the sacred stream, Thomas caught a glimpse of movement on the ridge above. 3 Apache warriors sat their horses like bronze statues, war paint striping their faces in patterns that spoke of deadly intent. Even at this distance, he could feel their eyes boring into him. "They've seen us," Aiyana said quietly. The lead warrior raised his lance, and Thomas saw the distinctive black and red markings that Aiyana had described. Apache war paint applied with ritual significance before a hunt. Only now, he and Aiyana were the quarry. "Kosen," Aiyana whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of love and fear. "My eldest brother, he has never failed to bring home his prey." They urged Dusty into a gallop across the desert floor, the horse's hooves throwing up clouds of dust that would make their trail easy to follow. Thomas knew they couldn't outrun Apache warriors on their own ground, but perhaps they could reach terrain that favored a man on horseback over those on foot. Behind them, the war cries began, ululating calls that echoed off the canyon walls like the voices of hunting spirits. The sound chilled Thomas's blood, carrying centuries of warfare and the promise of violent death. "Why are they painted for war?" Thomas shouted over the thunder of hooves. "Because they hunt not just a man but dishonor itself," Aiyana replied. "The paint connects them to the spirits of our warrior ancestors. It makes them more than human, makes them instruments of justice." Thomas risked a glance back and saw them now, 3 riders emerging from the canyon like avenging angels. They moved with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle, their ponies seemingly dancing across ground that would challenge any other mount. "How long before they catch us?" "On this ground, before the sun reaches its highest point." The certainty in her voice drove home the hopelessness of their situation. Thomas pushed Dusty harder, but the horse was already laboring under the double burden and the grueling pace. Sweat darkened the animal's coat, and Thomas could feel the powerful muscles beginning to tire. They crested a rise and saw the Badlands spreading before them, a maze of eroded stone pillars and narrow canyons that looked like the ruins of some ancient civilization. It was harsh, unforgiving country where a man could hide or die with equal ease. "There," Aiyana pointed toward a gap between 2 towering spires. "The Canyon of Whispers. Even my brothers fear that place. Why? It is where our ancestors buried the dishonored dead. Spirits linger there, angry and restless." Thomas urged Dusty toward the canyon entrance, but the horse balked, ears flat against his head. Something about the place spoke to animal instincts older than human understanding. The war cries behind them grew louder, more urgent. Kozan and his brothers were closing the distance with each passing minute, their superior knowledge of the terrain giving them every advantage. "Thomas," Aiyana said softly, her hand touching his shoulder, "if they take me alive, I will be cast out from the tribe. I would rather die clean than live in shame." "No one's dying today," Thomas replied grimly, though he wondered if he was making a promise he couldn't keep. They plunged into the Canyon of Whispers as the sun reached its zenith, leaving the open desert behind for a labyrinth of stone and shadow. The temperature dropped immediately, and strange echoes followed their passage, whispers that might have been wind through stone crevices, or something far more unsettling. Behind them, the pursuit continued relentlessly. The war paint on their hunters' faces gleamed in the filtered sunlight, marking them as instruments of tribal justice that would not be deterred by superstition or terrain. Thomas realized with growing dread that running might only delay the inevitable. Sooner or later, they would have to face the consequences of that moment by the sacred stream, and when they did, blood would likely be the price of resolution. The Canyon of Whispers lived up to its name as Thomas and Aiyana navigated the treacherous maze of stone passages. Every sound echoed strangely here. Their horses' hooves, their breathing, even the creak of leather, seemed amplified and distorted by the narrow walls that rose like cathedral spires around them. Dusty picked his way carefully over loose rocks and around fallen boulders, his ears constantly swiveling at sounds that had no visible source. The canyon floor was littered with smooth stones, worn by countless flash floods, creating a natural mosaic that shifted and clicked under their passage. "Stop here," Aiyana said suddenly, pointing to a narrow side passage barely wide enough for a horse. "We need shelter, and your horse needs rest." Thomas guided Dusty into the cramped space, which opened into a small circular chamber carved by wind and water over countless centuries. Ancient petroglyphs covered the walls, spirals, handprints and animal figures that seemed to watch them with knowing eyes. "What is this place?" Thomas asked, dismounting and helping Aiyana down. She approached the stone walls with reverence, her fingers tracing the carved symbols. "These are the old teachings left by the people who came before us. My grandmother taught me to read some of them." The petroglyphs were clearly ancient, worn smooth by time but still discernible in the filtered light that penetrated the chamber. Thomas found himself drawn to a particular section where human figures seemed to be engaged in some kind of ceremony or dance. "This one," Aiyana said, touching a spiral design, "speaks of the endless circle of life and death, and these handprints each represents a soul that passed this way, marking their presence for those who would follow." Despite their desperate situation, Thomas felt a strange peace in this hidden sanctuary. The pursuing war cries had faded, either because they had outdistanced their hunters or because the acoustics of the canyon masked all outside sounds. "Are we safe here?" he asked. Aiyana shook her head slowly. "My brothers know these canyons as well as I do, but they will be cautious. This place holds power that even warriors respect." She settled against one of the carved walls, and Thomas noticed how the ancient symbols seemed to frame her like some kind of sacred artwork. For the first time since their flight began, he had a chance to really look at her, not as an Apache enemy or an impossible complication, but as a woman. Her dark hair fell in thick braids, decorated with small silver ornaments that caught the light. Her duskin dress was beautifully crafted, with intricate beadwork that told stories he couldn't read, but somehow understood, spoke of skill and patience. Most striking were her eyes, intelligent, fierce, but also carrying a depth of sadness that spoke of losses beyond her years. "Why did you help me escape?" Thomas asked. "You could have called to your brothers, let them deal with me." Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, studying the petroglyphs as if seeking wisdom from the ancient artists. "Because you looked at me without hatred. Even in that first moment of shock, I saw no disgust in your eyes, only recognition of another human being." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I've never seen anyone more beautiful," he said quietly, then immediately regretted the words. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Beauty is a gift from the spirits," she replied simply. "To acknowledge it is not shameful, but beauty fades. What matters is what lies beneath." She pulled a small bundle from her medicine pouch and began arranging items on a flat stone, herbs, small carved fetishes, and what looked like colored sand. Thomas watched in fascination as she created an intricate pattern that seemed to pulse with meaning. "What are you doing?" Asking the spirits for guidance. "This is a crossroads for both of us. We need wisdom beyond our own understanding." As she worked, Aiyana began to sing in a low, melodic voice. The Apache words were incomprehensible to Thomas, but the tune seemed to resonate with the stone walls themselves, creating harmonies that raised the hair on his arms. "My grandmother taught me this song," she said when she finished. "It calls upon the spirits of this place to show us the true path forward." The chamber fell silent, except for the distant sound of wind through stone. Thomas found himself studying the petroglyphs with new eyes, seeing not primitive scratches, but a sophisticated attempt to communicate across the barriers of time and culture. "What do they say about us?" he asked. "Two people from different worlds, thrown together by chance?" Aiyana smiled for the first time since they'd met, transforming her face completely. "They say that some paths are chosen for us by forces greater than ourselves. The question is whether we have the courage to walk them." Outside, a sound made them both freeze, the distant echo of voices growing closer with each passing minute. Their brief sanctuary was about to become a trap. The voices outside their hidden chamber grew closer, and Thomas instinctively reached for his rifle. Aiyana's hand closed over his, stopping him with surprising strength. "No," she whispered, "violence will only bring more violence. But if they find us, then we face whatever comes together. But I will not have blood spilled in this sacred place." As they waited in tense silence, Aiyana's fingers unconsciously worried at something in her medicine pouch. She drew out a small, tarnished object, a broken cavalry button, brass worn smooth by handling. Thomas recognized it immediately as military issue, though it was damaged as if by great violence. "Where did you get that?" he asked softly. Aiyana's expression grew distant, her dark eyes reflecting pain that ran deeper than their current predicament. "It belonged to one of the soldiers who attacked our winter camp 3 seasons ago. My mother died in that raid." Thomas felt his stomach clench. He knew about the winter raids, had heard them discussed in the towns as necessary actions to protect settlers. But sitting here beside Aiyana, seeing the very real grief in her eyes, those distant military operations suddenly had faces, families, devastating personal cost. She was tending sick children in the medicine lodge when the cavalry came at dawn. Aiyana continued, her voice barely audible. "The soldiers didn't distinguish between warriors and healers. They shot anyone who moved." The broken button caught what little light filtered into the chamber, its edges jagged where it had been torn from a uniform. Thomas could imagine the scene: confusion, terror, the sound of gunfire echoing off canyon walls much like these. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Your people celebrate such victories. They call them necessary for progress, for civilization." Thomas thought of his father's stories, the pride with which Colonel McKenna had recounted his campaigns against hostiles. But those stories had never included details about medicine lodges or healers tending sick children. "Not all of us," he said quietly. "Some of us question whether any of this killing is necessary." Aiyana studied his face in the dim light, searching for truth. "Your father was a soldier, wasn't he? I can see it in the way you carry yourself, the discipline." "He was. Cavalry officer, fought in these very canyons, probably." Thomas paused, struggling with the implications. He might have been there that day. The possibility hung between them like a chasm. Thomas's father, the man he'd loved and respected, despite his growing doubts about the Indian wars, might have been responsible for Aiyana's deepest grief. "He spoke of honor," Thomas continued, "said he was protecting innocent families from savage raids. I grew up believing that. And now—" Thomas looked around the chamber, at the ancient petroglyphs that spoke of human continuity, of people who had lived and loved and lost on this land for countless generations. "Now I think we've all been telling ourselves stories to make the killing bearable." Aiyana turned the broken button over in her palm, its damaged surface reflecting her complicated feelings. "My mother saved this from the ashes of our camp. She said it was important to remember, to carry the pain so it would teach us." "What did it teach you?" "That hatred is a poison that destroys the one who carries it. My mother forgave the soldiers before she died. She said they were afraid men following afraid leaders, and that fear makes people do terrible things." Thomas felt tears threatening, for Aiyana's loss, for his own complicated inheritance, for all the unnecessary grief that stretched between their peoples like an endless battlefield. "I carry this button not to nurture hatred, but to remember that every enemy has a mother who loves them," Aiyana said. "Even the men who killed her were someone's children." The voices outside had faded, suggesting their pursuers had moved on to search other passages. But neither Thomas nor Aiyana seemed eager to leave this moment. "Come to you, painful honesty. Your father," Aiyana asked gently, "did the wars change him?" Thomas nodded slowly. He came home different each time, quieter. Sometimes I'd find him standing in his study, just staring at that cavalry saber on the wall, and I could tell he was seeing things I couldn't imagine. The weight of necessary violence, Aiyana said. It breaks something in a man's spirit, even when he believes his cause is just. They sat in contemplative silence, two people from warring cultures, finding unexpected common ground in shared grief. The broken button seemed to glow in Aiyana's palm, no longer just a relic of tragedy, but a bridge between their separate sorrows. Perhaps, Thomas said finally, our peoples have more in common than either side wants to admit. Perhaps, Aiyana agreed, carefully returning the button to her medicine pouch. Perhaps that's why we were brought together, to learn what our father's generation never could. By late afternoon, the pursuit had moved on, and the silence in their hidden chamber grew oppressive. Thomas's stomach growled audibly, reminding him that neither of them had eaten since dawn. Dusty needed water, and they couldn't remain trapped in the petroglyph's chamber indefinitely. We need to move, Aiyana said, echoing his thoughts. But first you need to learn how to survive in this country. She led him out into the main canyon, where shadows provided some relief from the brutal desert heat. Thomas watched in amazement as she seemed to read the landscape like a book written in stone and sand. Water, she said, pointing to what looked like solid rock. You see nothing, but the desert tells many stories to those who know how to listen. Following a barely visible animal trail, she led him to a depression in the rock where a few precious drops of moisture had collected. It wasn't much, but it was enough to wet Dusty's nose and provide a few swallows for themselves. How did you know? Thomas asked. My grandmother taught me to see with more than eyes. Watch the insects, they never stray far from water. See how this rock is stained? That means water runs here during storms. The desert keeps its secrets, but it will share them with those who approach with respect. As they moved deeper into the canyon system, Aiyana continued to demonstrate survival skills that left Thomas humbled. She identified edible plants growing in seemingly barren crevices, showed him how to find shelter from the wind, and pointed out dangers he would never have noticed: loose rocks that could start slides, plants whose thorns carried poison, areas where flash floods had carved deadly traps. When evening approached, she stopped near a cluster of barrel cacti and pulled a small knife from her belt. With careful precision, she cut into one of the plants and collected the precious moisture inside. Drink slowly, she instructed, offering him the makeshift cup she'd fashioned from a large leaf. Too much at once will make you sick. The liquid was bitter but life-giving. Thomas found himself watching her hands as she worked, graceful, capable, marked by small scars that spoke of a lifetime spent in this harsh environment. Around her neck hung a simple silver cross on a thin chain, incongruous among her traditional Apache ornaments. You're Christian? He asked, surprised. Aiyana touched the pendant self-consciously. This belonged to my mother. The missionary who taught me English gave it to her when she was dying. He said it would help her find peace in the next world. And you kept it? I keep it because love transcends the boundaries men create. My mother found comfort in this symbol, so it carries her spirit for me. She looked at him directly. Does it disturb you that I honor both Apache spirits and the Christian God? Thomas considered the question seriously. His own faith had been shaken by the violence he'd witnessed, the disparity between Christian teachings of love and the harsh realities of frontier life. I think your mother was wise, he said finally. Maybe the divine speaks to different people in different ways, but the message is the same: love, compassion, understanding. Aiyana smiled, and he noticed how the expression transformed her entire face. You're not what I expected from a white rancher. What did you expect? Someone who saw Apache as obstacles to be removed, not as people with their own wisdom and faith. As twilight painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and purple, they found a sheltered alcove where they could rest safely. Aiyana gathered dried wood with practiced efficiency, while Thomas tended to Dusty, checking the horse's hooves and rubbing down his coat with handfuls of dry grass. No fire, Aiyana said as Thomas prepared to strike a match. The smoke could give away our position. They shared a cold meal of jerky from Thomas's saddlebags and edible roots Aiyana had gathered. The food was sparse, but somehow satisfying, the simple act of sharing sustenance creating an intimacy neither had expected. Tell me about your ranch, Aiyana said as they settled against the canyon wall to rest. Thomas found himself describing not just the land and buildings, but his dreams for the place, the vision of a self-sufficient operation that could coexist peacefully with the natural rhythms of the desert. As he talked, he realized he was sharing hopes he'd never voiced aloud, even to himself. "It sounds like a good place," Aiyana said softly, "a place where different worlds might learn to live together." "Would you?" Thomas began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the thought. "Would I what? Would you want to see it? If we survive this?" The question hung between them in the gathering darkness, carrying implications neither was quite ready to examine. Dawn brought the sound of horses and the metallic jingle of cavalry equipment echoing through the canyon walls. Thomas jerked awake to find Aiyana already alert, her body tense as she listened to the approaching sounds. "Soldiers," she whispered, "a full patrol by the sound of it." They crept to the edge of their shelter and peered down the canyon. Below them, a column of blue-uniformed cavalry picked their way carefully along the rocky floor. Thomas counted at least 20 men, their weapons ready, their eyes scanning the canyon walls with practiced wariness. "Lieutenant Morrison's patrol." Thomas recognized the officer leading the column. "I know him from town." The patrol stopped directly below their position, and Thomas heard Morrison's voice clearly in the still morning air. "Sergeant, deploy the men in a search pattern. Those Apache raiders have to be somewhere in these canyons." "What raiders?" Aiyana whispered, her face pale with concern. Thomas strained to hear more as the sergeant responded. "Sir, the Henderson Ranch was hit last night. They took horses and supplies, killed 2 hands who tried to stop them." Morrison pulled out a folded document from his jacket pocket, and even at a distance, Thomas could see the official military seal. "According to intelligence from Fort Huachuca, we're dealing with a war party led by the sons of Chief Nalnish. They're to be considered extremely dangerous." Aiyana's sharp intake of breath told Thomas everything he needed to know. Her brothers weren't just hunting them anymore. They had expanded their activities, striking at white settlements. The careful balance she'd described between her people and the military was collapsing. "Orders are shoot to kill," Morrison continued. "No prisoners. The territorial governor wants this threat eliminated permanently." Thomas felt Aiyana tremble beside him. The document Morrison held represented a death sentence not just for her brothers, but potentially for her entire family and tribe. The military had clearly decided that negotiation was no longer an option. "Sir," the sergeant asked, "what about the woman? Intelligence suggests she's traveling with them." "Apache women can be as dangerous as the men, Sergeant. The orders make no distinction." The casual way Morrison dismissed Aiyana's life, reducing her to just another target to be eliminated, filled Thomas with a rage he hadn't known he possessed. This was the woman who had saved his life, taught him to see the desert's hidden beauty, shared her deepest griefs and hopes. To these soldiers, she was nothing more than a military objective. As the patrol prepared to move deeper into the canyon system, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. He began to rise, ready to call out to Morrison, to surrender himself and try to explain the situation. Aiyana's hand clamped down on his arm with iron strength. "No," she hissed, "they will kill us both. You heard their orders. Morrison's a reasonable man. I can make him understand." "Understand what? That you've been traveling with an Apache woman who's supposed to be dead? That you've learned to see my people as human?" Her dark eyes blazed with desperate intensity. "Your Lieutenant Morrison has his orders. Reason has no place in this anymore." Below them, the patrol began to move out, their search pattern taking them toward the very passages where Cozen and his brothers might be hiding. Thomas realized with growing horror that they were about to witness a massacre or participate in one. "We have to warn them," Aiyana said, her voice tight with anguish. "My brothers don't know about the shoot-to-kill orders. They still think this is about honor, about bringing me home. If we warn them, we'll be exposing ourselves to both sides," Thomas pointed out. "Then that's what we do." Aiyana's voice carried the steel of absolute determination. "I will not let my brothers die because of my choices." Thomas looked at the military orders still visible in Morrison's hand, then at the woman beside him, whose courage put his own to shame. The document represented everything wrong with the escalating violence between their peoples, the reduction of complex human relationships to simple military objectives. "How do we reach them before the cavalry does?" he asked. For the first time since the soldiers appeared, Aiyana smiled. You're learning to think like an Apache. We don't go around the patrol, we go over them. She pointed to a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a person to traverse. It would be dangerous, potentially deadly, but it offered a route that no cavalry patrol would expect anyone to attempt. Together? Thomas asked. Together, she confirmed, and began checking her medicine pouch to ensure nothing would be lost during the treacherous climb ahead. The military orders below represented death and the end of hope. Above them lay a path that might save lives if they had the courage to take it. The ledge proved even more treacherous than it had appeared from below. Thomas pressed himself against the canyon wall, his fingers searching for handholds in the ancient red stone as he followed Aiyana along the narrow path. One misstep would send them plummeting to the rocks below, ending their desperate mission before it began. Aiyana moved with the sure-footed grace of someone raised in this vertical world, but even she paused occasionally to test loose stones before trusting her weight to them. Behind them, the sounds of the cavalry patrol grew fainter as Morrison's men spread out through the lower canyon passages. There, Aiyana whispered, pointing ahead to where the ledge widened into a natural platform, the sacred circle. Thomas saw it as they reached the wider area, an ancient medicine wheel carved into the living rock, stones arranged in a perfect circle, with spokes radiating toward the cardinal directions, the pattern worn smooth by countless generations of hands. At the center sat a larger stone that served as an altar, its surface polished by ceremony and time. My people have used this place for vision quests for longer than memory, Aiyana explained as she knelt beside the stone circle. Here the spirits speak most clearly to those who seek truth. She opened her medicine pouch and began arranging sacred items within the wheel, sage for cleansing, tobacco for prayers, small crystals that caught the morning light like trapped stars. Thomas watched in fascination as she transformed the ancient site into a living altar. "What are you doing?" "Asking for guidance and for protection, for my brothers, for your Lieutenant Morrison's men, for us." She struck flint to steel, lighting a small bundle of sage that filled the air with aromatic smoke. Sometimes the only way to prevent violence is to change the hearts of those who would commit it. As she began to chant in the old language, Thomas felt something shift in the air around them. Whether it was the power of the sacred site, the intensity of Aiyana's faith, or simply the beauty of the ancient ritual, he found himself drawn into the ceremony despite his unfamiliarity with Apache traditions. The medicine wheel seemed to pulse with life as Aiyana's voice rose and fell in patterns that spoke to something deeper than rational thought. The morning sun, now higher in the sky, cast the shadow of the central stone across different sections of the circle, marking time in a way that connected this moment to countless others, stretching back through history. "My grandmother taught me that this place holds the wisdom of all who came before," Aiyana said as her chanting ended. Warriors and healers, mothers and children, all seeking answers to questions that have no easy solutions. Thomas knelt beside her within the sacred circle, feeling the weight of the moment. What does it tell you? That courage is not the absence of fear, but acting rightly despite it. That love is stronger than hatred, but sometimes love requires sacrifice. She looked at him directly, her dark eyes reflecting the depth of her conviction. That some paths can only be walked together. Below them, a new sound echoed through the canyon, the distinctive war cry of Apache warriors. Aiyana went rigid with recognition. "Kosen," she breathed. "He's found the soldiers." The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the sharp crack of rifle fire. The confrontation they'd hoped to prevent was beginning, and they were too far away to intervene directly. "The circle," Aiyana said urgently, her hands moving to rearrange the sacred stones. "If I can complete the protection ceremony, it might influence the outcome." "How?" "By calling upon the spirits of this place to guide both sides away from unnecessary death. The medicine wheel connects all things. What happens here affects what happens everywhere." Thomas didn't fully understand the mechanics of what she was doing, but he could see the desperate faith that drove her actions. As she worked, repositioning stones according to some pattern known only to her, he found himself believing that this ancient wisdom might indeed have power over the violence erupting below. The rifle fire intensified, echoing off the canyon walls in a deadly symphony. Mixed with the gunshots came shouts in both English and Apache orders, warnings, cries of pain that carried up from the battlefield below. "Help me," Aiyana said, her voice strained with urgency. "Place your hands on the center stone and focus on peace, on understanding between our peoples." Thomas pressed his palms against the warm stone, feeling its solid reality beneath his fingers. As he did, Aiyana's voice rose again in prayer, calling upon forces older than the conflicts that had brought them to this moment. In the medicine wheel, surrounded by the accumulated prayers of countless generations, they sought to change the course of history through faith, hope, and the desperate belief that love could indeed triumph over hatred. The battle below raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. From their perch above the medicine wheel, Thomas and Aiyana could see muzzle flashes and hear the distinctive whistle of arrows cutting through the canyon air. The sound that made Aiyana's blood run cold, however, was the sharp crack of obsidian arrowheads striking stone. "Cosen's arrows," she whispered, recognizing the unique sound. "He naps his own points from volcanic glass. They're sharper than any metal blade." Thomas peered down at the battle unfolding below, trying to make sense of the chaos. Morrison's cavalry had taken defensive positions behind fallen rocks, their disciplined volleys echoing off the canyon walls. But the Apache warriors moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing among the stone formations with deadly precision. A glint of black glass caught the sunlight as an arrow buried itself in a wooden rifle stock just feet from where Lieutenant Morrison crouched. The obsidian point had split the wood cleanly, rendering the weapon useless. Thomas realized he was witnessing master craftsmanship turn to lethal purpose. "How many arrows does he carry?" Thomas asked. 24, Aiyana replied without hesitation. "Each one blessed by the medicine man, each one capable of finding its target, even in darkness." Another arrow sang through the air, this one finding its mark in a cavalry trooper's shoulder. The man cried out and fell back, clutching the wound as blood seeped between his fingers. Thomas could see the black obsidian point protruding from the blue fabric of his uniform. "We have to do something," Thomas said. "At this rate, both sides will be slaughtered." Aiyana nodded grimly, her eyes tracking the movement of familiar figures among the rocks below. "Delche is flanking them from the south. Naishe approaches from the north. They're coordinating their attack. Soon they'll close the trap." The precision of the Apache tactics became clear as Thomas watched. What had seemed like random harassment was actually a carefully orchestrated assault designed to drive the cavalry into an indefensible position. Morrison's men, for all their military training, were fighting on unfamiliar ground against opponents who knew every stone and shadow. "Can you call to them? Tell them to stop. If I reveal myself, my brothers will abandon their attack to reach me. The soldiers will have clear shots at them as they cross open ground." Aiyana's voice was tight with anguish, "And if the cavalry sees me, they'll concentrate their fire on my position." Below them, Cosen appeared on a high ledge, his bow drawn back to full extension. The obsidian-tipped arrow gleamed like black fire in the morning sun, aimed directly at Lieutenant Morrison's chest. From this angle, at this distance, it would be an impossible shot for anyone but a master archer. Time seemed suspended as Thomas watched Cosen's perfect form, feet planted, shoulders squared, the bowstring drawn to his ear with the fluid grace of countless hours of practice. The obsidian point tracked Morrison's movement with mechanical precision. "No," Aiyana breathed, rising instinctively as if to shield the cavalry officer with her own body. The sound that followed wasn't the whistle of an arrow, but something far more unexpected, a voice calling out in Apache from the canyon floor. All combat ceased instantly as the words echoed off the stone walls. "Cosen, Delche, hold your arrows." Thomas and Aiyana both leaned forward, trying to see who had intervened. Below them, a figure emerged from behind a large boulder, an elderly Apache man, his gray hair braided with silver ornaments, his presence commanding immediate respect from all the warriors. "Grandfather," Aiyana whispered, her voice filled with reverence and relief. The old man walked calmly into the open space between the two forces, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Neither side fired, held back by something more powerful than military discipline or warrior training, the authority of someone whose wisdom transcended the immediate conflict. "I am Kochiska, medicine man of the Chiricahua," he called out in clear English. "I come to speak truth in a place where too many lies have been told." Lieutenant Morrison slowly rose from his defensive position, his rifle lowered but ready. "What do you want, old man?" "To prevent needless death, to speak of things you do not know." Kociska's voice carried the weight of years and the certainty of someone who had seen too much violence. "You hunt warriors who seek not war, but the return of family honor." On the high ledge, Coulson still held his bow at full draw, the obsidian point steady despite the long tension. But his eyes were fixed on his grandfather, waiting for guidance that would determine whether this day ended in blood or understanding. The medicine man looked directly up at their hiding place, his ancient eyes somehow finding them among the shadows. "Come down, granddaughter. It is time for truth to be spoken." The descent from the medicine wheel felt like walking into another world entirely. Thomas followed Aiyana down the treacherous path, knowing that they were leaving behind the safety of the sacred circle for the dangerous reality of the standoff below. With each step, the weight of their decision pressed more heavily upon them. When they finally reached the canyon floor, an uneasy silence gripped both the Apache warriors and the cavalry soldiers. Weapons remained ready, but not quite aimed as all eyes focused on the unlikely pair emerging from the rocks. Kociska stood in the center of the open ground, his weathered face serene despite the tension surrounding him. As Aiyana approached, he opened his arms to embrace her, and Thomas saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "Grandfather," she whispered in Apache, and the old man's response was too soft for anyone else to hear. Kociska remained on his high perch, the obsidian arrow still nocked but no longer drawn. His dark eyes burned with questions as he studied his sister and the white man who stood beside her. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward cautiously, his hand resting on his sidearm. "You're harboring a fugitive, old man. Stand aside and let us take her into custody." "Custody?" Kociska's voice carried a note of genuine puzzlement. "For what crime?" "She's been traveling with Apache raiders who attacked the Henderson ranch. That makes her an accomplice to murder." The medicine man turned to look at Aiyana, his expression thoughtful. "Granddaughter, is this true?" "No, grandfather. I have been with this man since yesterday morning, when he accidentally discovered me at the sacred waters. We have harmed no one." Morrison's face darkened. "Then explain why your brothers killed 2 ranch hands last night." It was Coulson who answered, calling down from his position. "We took horses because ours were lamed. We took supplies because we had none. The white men attacked us with guns. We defended ourselves." "You're lying," Morrison snapped. "Those men were murdered in cold blood." From his position behind another outcropping, Delshid emerged into the open, his own bow ready but not drawn. "We are warriors, not butchers. If your men died, it was because they chose to fight rather than let us take what we needed." Thomas found himself studying the faces of both sides, seeing the honest conviction in each. The soldiers believed they were pursuing murderous raiders. The Apache believed they were defending themselves against unprovoked attack. The truth, he realized, lay somewhere in the middle, a tragedy of misunderstanding that had escalated beyond anyone's control. But it was what Kociska pulled from his medicine bundle that changed everything. The object was small, tarnished, and instantly recognizable, a wedding ring set, the woman's band still nestled inside the man's larger circle. The metal was stained with something dark that made Thomas's stomach clench. "These were found at the Henderson ranch," the medicine man said solemnly. "Not taken by my grandsons, but discovered among the ashes." Morrison stared at the rings, his face going pale. "That's impossible. The Hendersons were alive when we left to pursue you. Were they?" Kociska's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "Or were they already dead when my grandsons arrived seeking horses?" The implication hit Thomas like a physical blow. If the Hendersons were already dead, then Coulson and his brothers hadn't killed anyone. They had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, making them convenient scapegoats for someone else's crime. "Who else knew you were riding out to hunt Apache?" Thomas asked Morrison, his mind racing through the possibilities. "Only my sergeant and—" Morrison stopped, his face growing even paler. "Only the civilians who reported the raid." "What civilians?" Aiyana asked sharply. "The Blake brothers. They claimed they witnessed the attack, barely escaped with their lives." Thomas knew the Blake brothers by reputation, drifters and troublemakers who had been suspected of cattle rustling but never caught. They were exactly the type of men who might murder an isolated family for their valuables, then blame Apache raiders to cover their tracks. Kosciuszko held up the wedding rings, letting them catch the sunlight. These belonged to people who loved each other, who built a life together in this harsh land. They deserved justice, not convenient lies. The Blakes, Morrison said slowly, the truth dawning in his eyes. They knew the Hendersons kept money in the house. They knew the family routines. Cosson called down from his perch, his voice carrying new urgency. While you hunt innocent men, the real killers escape. The wedding rings seemed to pulse with accusation in Kosciuszko's weathered hands, silent witnesses to a crime that had nearly sparked a massacre between two peoples already scarred by too much violence. "What do we do now?" Morrison asked, his military certainty shaken by the revelation. "Now," the medicine man replied, "we seek justice for the dead and truth for the living." The Polot, the uneasy truce that followed Kosciuszko's revelation, held just long enough for both sides to reach a grudging agreement to pursue the Blake brothers together. But as they prepared to leave the canyon, Thomas stumbled on loose rocks and fell hard against a sharp outcropping, tearing a jagged gash in his left arm from elbow to wrist. Blood flowed freely from the wound, staining his shirt and dripping onto the canyon floor. Lieutenant Morrison took one look at the injury and shook his head grimly. "That needs stitching, and we don't have a field surgeon with us. Best we can do is bandage it tight and hope infection doesn't set in." Aiyana stepped forward without hesitation, kneeling beside Thomas as he sat propped against a boulder. "I can tend this properly," she said, opening her medicine pouch, "but I'll need privacy and time to work." Morrison looked skeptical. "Apache medicine? No offense, miss, but—" "She's a trained healer," Kosciuszko interrupted firmly. "Among our people, she has saved more lives than your army doctors have taken." From her medicine pouch, Aiyana withdrew a carefully wrapped bundle of healing herbs: yarrow for stopping bleeding, echinacea root for preventing infection, willow bark for pain, and several others Thomas didn't recognize. The bundle was bound with sinew and decorated with small blue beads that seemed to glow in the filtered canyon light. "These plants have been blessed and prepared according to the old ways," she explained as she unwrapped the bundle with reverent care. "Each one was gathered at the proper time, dried in sacred smoke, and charged with healing energy by our medicine people." Thomas watched in fascination as she arranged the herbs on a flat stone, crushing some between her palms and mixing others with water from her small gourd. The aromatic scent that rose from her preparations was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, earthy, clean, and somehow alive with possibility. "This will hurt," she warned, her dark eyes meeting his with gentle concern. "But the pain means the medicine is working." She began by cleaning the wound with a solution that made Thomas bite back a cry of pain. The liquid burned like fire, but he could see the bleeding slow almost immediately. Her touch was confident and sure, the movements of someone who had done this many times before. "Tell me about your ranch," she said softly as she worked, her voice providing a welcome distraction from the intense sensation of healing, herbs being applied to raw flesh. "What does the land look like?" Thomas found himself describing the rolling hills and hidden valleys of his property, the way morning mist clung to the grasslands, the sound of cattle lowing in the evening quiet. As he talked, Aiyana's hands moved with gentle precision, applying poultices and binding the wound with strips of soft deerskin. "It sounds peaceful," she murmured, her fingers surprisingly tender as she secured the bandage. "A place where someone could heal from old wounds." Their eyes met, and Thomas realized she wasn't just talking about his injured arm. There was something in her touch, in the careful way she attended to his pain, that spoke of deeper understanding, recognition of hurts that went beyond the physical. "The herbs will draw out any poison and speed the healing," she explained, sitting back on her heels to examine her work. "But you must keep the wound clean and change the dressing each day. Will you show me how?" The question came out before Thomas could stop it, and he felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I mean, if we're traveling together to find the Blake brothers." A small smile played at the corners of Aiyana's mouth. "Yes, I'll show you. Healing is knowledge that should be shared, not hoarded." Lieutenant Morrison approached cautiously, his skepticism evident as he examined the bandaged arm. "How does it feel, McKenna?" Thomas moved his arm experimentally and was surprised to find that while it was tender, the sharp agony had already subsided to a manageable ache. "Better than I expected, actually. Apache medicine has been keeping people alive in this desert for longer than white men have been in this territory." Kochiska observed mildly. Perhaps there are things your people could learn from ours. As Aiyana carefully rewrapped her healing herbs bundle, Thomas found himself watching her hands again. Those same fingers that had just eased his pain with such skill had also held a broken cavalry button while grieving her mother's death. The contradiction struck him deeply, how someone who had every reason to hate could instead choose to heal. "Thank you," he said quietly, and meant it in ways that went far beyond gratitude for medical treatment. Aiyana's smile warmed her entire face. "Healing is what I do, Thomas McKenna. It's who I am." By late afternoon, the unlikely alliance of cavalry and Apache warriors had tracked the Blake brothers to a narrow valley where storm clouds gathered like dark omens overhead. The trail was clear now, boot prints that matched no Apache moccasin, horse tracks from stolen animals, and carelessly discarded evidence of the real criminal's passage. Lieutenant Morrison called a halt as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "We need shelter. This storm looks like it means business." As if summoned by his words, lightning split the darkening sky, followed by thunder that rolled through the valley like the voice of angry gods. The wind picked up, driving dust and debris before the approaching deluge. Cosin pointed toward a cluster of large boulders that had tumbled from the valley walls eons ago. "There we can find protection among the rocks." They scrambled for cover, just as the storm unleashed its full fury. Rain fell in sheets so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Lightning transformed the landscape into a flickering series of stark photographs, white bright moments of clarity, followed by impenetrable darkness. Thomas found himself pressed against Aiyana in the cramped shelter of an overhanging boulder, their bodies sharing warmth as the temperature plummeted with the storm's arrival. The space was barely large enough for two people, forcing an intimacy that both thrilling and terrifying. Outside their rocky sanctuary, the lightning revealed a sight that took his breath away. A massive tree on the ridge above them, split down the middle by some ancient lightning strike, but still standing, its two halves spreading like welcoming arms against the storm-dark sky. The split trunk created a perfect frame for the valley beyond, as if nature itself had crafted a window to watch the world. "The Tree of Two Hearts," Aiyana whispered, following his gaze. "My grandmother told me stories about that tree. She said it was split by lightning on the day her own grandmother chose love over duty, when she married a warrior from an enemy tribe. The symbolism wasn't lost on Thomas, a tree divided but not destroyed, finding a way to grow stronger from what should have been a fatal wound, like them perhaps, finding unity despite the forces that should have kept them apart." Thunder crashed overhead so close that the ground shook beneath them. In the brilliant flash that followed, Thomas saw Aiyana's face illuminated like a vision, her dark eyes reflecting the lightning, her lips slightly parted as she watched the storm's display of raw power. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. "Of the storm? No. Lightning is sacred to my people. It brings life-giving rain and cleanses the earth." She turned to meet his eyes in the darkness between flashes. "But I am afraid of other things." "What things?" "Of the way you look at me. Of the way my heart responds when you're near, of what my people will say when they learn I've given my heart to a white man." The words hung between them in the charged air, as electric as the lightning splitting the sky. Thomas felt his pulse racing, and he knew it had nothing to do with the storm. "And I'm afraid," he admitted, "of how empty my life was before I met you, of going back to my ranch and finding it meaningless without you there, of losing you to a world that says we can't be together." Another lightning flash illuminated the split tree above them, its two halves reaching toward each other across the gap that would never fully heal, but had somehow become a source of strength rather than weakness. "The tree teaches us something," Aiyana said, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "That some wounds become doorways. That what breaks us apart can also show us how to grow back together, stronger than before." Thomas reached for her hand in the darkness, feeling the calluses from her healing work, the strength in her fingers. "Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that when this storm passes, when we find the Blake brothers and clear your name and mine, we'll still face a choice. We can let the world's expectations keep us apart, or we can be like that tree, damaged but not defeated, split but still standing." Lightning crashed again, and in its stark illumination, Thomas saw his future written in Aiyana's eyes. Not the lonely existence he'd planned, tending cattle and nursing old grudges, but something he'd never dared to dream of, a partnership that transcended the artificial boundaries men drew around their hearts. "When this storm ends," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I want to show you my ranch. I want to build something there that honors both our peoples, both our ways of life. And I want to help you build it," she replied, her lips curving in a smile that outshone the lightning. The storm raged on above them, but in their shelter beneath the lightning-split tree, Thomas and Aiyana found the calm center where love blooms strongest in the eye of the hurricane, where two hearts finally speak the same language. Dawn broke clear and cold after the storm, revealing a transformed landscape washed clean by the night's fury. The unlikely alliance of cavalry soldiers and Apache warriors emerged from their various shelters, steam rising from their damp clothing as the sun began its work of drying the desert. Thomas watched Aiyana as she spoke quietly with her grandfather, their conversation in rapid Apache punctuated by glances in his direction. Whatever they discussed, it ended with Kochiska placing his weathered hands on her shoulders in what looked like a blessing. "The Blake brothers' trail leads toward the Sacred Valley," Kosin announced, pointing north toward a gap in the surrounding cliffs. "But if we enter there uninvited, we risk the anger of the spirits." Lieutenant Morrison looked skeptical. "Spirits don't concern me as much as murderers getting away." "They should," Kochiska said gravely. "The Sacred Valley is where my father, War Chief Nalish, holds court. If we bring this conflict to his doorstep, we must be prepared for judgment." The old medicine man reached into his bundle and withdrew an object that made every Apache present fall silent with reverence. It was a staff, perhaps 4 feet long, carved from a single piece of dark wood that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the morning light. The surface was inlaid with turquoise and silver in patterns that spiraled from base to tip, culminating in a cluster of eagle feathers bound with sinew and blessed with sacred symbols. "The staff of the war chief," Aiyana whispered to Thomas, "my father's symbol of authority over all the Chiricahua bands. Grandfather carries it as his messenger." The staff represented more than mere authority. It was the embodiment of tribal law, the physical manifestation of a leader's responsibility to his people. In the hands of Kochiska, it transformed him from an elderly medicine man into the official voice of Apache justice. "We will approach Chief Nalnish together," the old man announced. "All of us, Apache and cavalry alike. The Blake brothers have fled to ground that belongs to neither your people nor mine, but to the old spirits. Only by facing this together can we hope to bring justice without more bloodshed." Morrison studied the ornate staff with growing unease. "What exactly are you proposing?" "That you and your men accompany us to my father's stronghold," Aiyana explained. "That you speak truth before the war chief. As we will speak truth, let him judge whether the peace between our peoples can survive this test." The proposal was unprecedented, cavalry soldiers voluntarily entering the heart of Apache territory, placing themselves at the mercy of the same chief they'd been ordered to hunt. For Morrison, it represented either the height of diplomatic courage or military suicide. "My orders were to eliminate Apache raiders," Morrison said slowly, "not to negotiate with war chiefs." "Your orders were based on lies," Kosin pointed out from his position nearby. "If you truly seek justice for the Henderson family, you'll find it only by uncovering truth." Thomas stepped forward, his bandaged arm a reminder of the previous day's violence and healing. "Lieutenant, I'll vouch for these people. They've had every opportunity to kill us and haven't. That should count for something." Morrison looked around at the mixed group, his own soldiers standing uneasily beside Apache warriors, who yesterday had been shooting at them. The war chief's staff in Kochiska's hands seemed to pulse with authority, demanding respect even from those who didn't understand its significance. "If we do this," Morrison said finally, "and your chief decides we're enemies, what guarantee do we have of safe passage out?" Kochiska raised the staff toward the 4 directions, speaking words in Apache that carried the weight of sacred oath. "I pledge upon this symbol of our law that you will enter as seekers of truth and leave as honorable men, regardless of what we discover about the Blake brothers." "What does that mean exactly?" one of Morrison's sergeants asked nervously. "It means," Aiyana translated, "that you're under the protection of Apache law while you seek justice. To harm you would bring shame upon my father's name and his ancestors' spirits." The staff caught the morning sunlight, its turquoise inlays gleaming like captured sky. In its presence, old enemies found themselves bound by laws older than their conflict, united in the pursuit of truth that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. "Very well," Morrison said, his decision carrying the weight of command. "We follow your chief's messenger, but I want it understood. If this is a trap, if any harm comes to my men, the consequences will be severe." Kosciuszko smiled, his weathered face creasing with something that might have been amusement. "Lieutenant, the only trap here is the one the Blake brothers have set for themselves. Justice has a way of finding those who try to hide from it." As they prepared to enter the sacred valley, the war chief's staff stood as witness to an unprecedented alliance, enemies choosing trust over suspicion, seeking truth over convenient blame. The sacred valley opened before them like a hidden world, protected by towering cliffs that had sheltered the Chiricahua for generations. Ancient petroglyphs marked the entrance, warning symbols that spoke of sacred ground and the consequences of trespass. But today, under the protection of the war chief's staff, both Apache and cavalry entered together. War Chief Nalnish awaited them in the center of the valley, seated on a natural throne of red stone that commanded a view of all approaches. He was a man in his 50s, still powerful despite the gray threading his black hair, his presence radiating the authority that had kept his people alive through decades of warfare and displacement. At his feet lay the most sacred object in Chiricahua culture, a ceremonial peace pipe carved from red pipestone and decorated with eagle feathers, turquoise beads, and silver bands that caught the morning light. The pipe was enormous, nearly 3 feet long, its bowl crafted to hold tobacco blessed by every medicine man in the tribe. It represented not just peace, but the spiritual power to bind enemies into lasting friendship. "My daughter," Nalnish said in English, rising to embrace Aiyana, "you returned to us under strange circumstances." "Father," Aiyana's voice carried both love and apprehension, "I come seeking justice and asking for wisdom." The war chief's eyes moved to Thomas, studying him with the intense gaze of a man accustomed to reading character in an instant. "And this is the white man who has seen what should not be seen. This is Thomas McKenna, father. He is a good man caught in circumstances beyond his control." Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Chief Nalnish, I'm Lieutenant Morrison, U.S. Cavalry. I come seeking truth about the Henderson murders. Ah, the soldier who would hunt my sons for crimes they did not commit." The war chief's voice carried no anger, only the weariness of a man who had seen too many false accusations. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what brings you to believe my family capable of murdering innocents?" Morrison straightened, his military bearing intact despite the unusual circumstances. "We received reports that Apache raiders attacked the Henderson ranch, killed 2 men, and stole horses and supplies. Reports from whom? The Blake brothers. They claimed to have witnessed the attack." A murmur ran through the assembled Apache warriors, and Nalnish's expression darkened. "The Blake brothers, who steal cattle and blame my people, the same men who burned the trading post and let Apache tracks be found nearby." Thomas felt pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place. "You know about them. We have watched these men for months," Nalnish replied. "They take what they want and ensure Apache are blamed for their crimes. They are clever, these brothers. They know the white man's hatred will make any accusation against my people believable." Kosciuszko stepped forward, offering the war chief's staff to Nalnish. "The Blake brothers are here, in the sacred valley. They seek to hide among the ancient ruins where they believe we dare not follow." "But they are wrong," Nalnish said, accepting the staff and holding it high. "Justice knows no boundaries, recognizes no sanctuary for those who would profit from hatred between peoples." He lifted the great peace pipe and began the ritual of filling it with sacred tobacco. "We will smoke together, Apache and cavalry, and then we will find these men who have caused so much grief between our peoples." Morrison looked uncertain. "Chief, I'm not sure about smoking, whatever that is." "It is tobacco mixed with sweet grass and sage," Aiyana explained. "To smoke the peace pipe means you pledge to speak only truth and to honor whatever agreement we reach. And if I refuse," Nalnish smiled grimly, "then you may leave my valley immediately, and my sons will deal with the Blake brothers in the old way. But you will never know whether justice was served or whether innocent men paid for the crimes of guilty ones." The ultimatum was clear: participate in the Apache ceremony of truth-telling, or abandon any hope of resolving the conflict peacefully. Morrison looked around at his men, seeing their nervous but determined faces. "What does the ceremony require?" he asked. "That each man who smokes pledges to accept the judgment of the pipe," Nalnish explained. "If the Blake brothers are guilty, they face Apache justice. If my sons are guilty, which they are not, they face your justice. But the truth must be spoken by all, without reservation." The war chief began to light the pipe with a coal from a sacred fire, the sweet smoke rising like incense in the morning air. "This pipe has been smoked by my father and his father before him. It has sealed treaties that lasted generations and exposed lies that would have led to war, and it will show us the path to justice," Aiyana added softly, "if we have the courage to follow where truth leads." The peace pipe glowed like a sacred beacon, waiting to bind former enemies in a quest for justice that would determine the future of both their peoples. The peace pipe made its way around the circle, each man taking his oath to speak truth and honor the judgment that would follow. When it reached Thomas, the sweet smoke filled his lungs with the weight of ceremony, binding him to promises older than the conflicts that had brought them together. The Blake brothers were found exactly where Nalnish had predicted, hiding among the ancient ruins at the valley's heart, their stolen horses grazing nearby. They came out fighting, guns blazing, but surrounded by both Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers. Their resistance was brief and futile. What followed was unlike any trial Thomas had ever witnessed. War Chief Nalnish presided with the authority of tribal law, while Lieutenant Morrison represented military justice. The evidence was presented not in a courtroom, but under the open sky, with the sacred pipe serving as witness to every word spoken. The Blake brothers' guilt was undeniable once their possessions were searched. They carried jewelry that had belonged to the Henderson family, had money that matched amounts known to be in the ranch house, and their boots matched tracks found at the murder scene. More damning still, they had kept a detailed journal of their crimes, planning to sell the information to penny newspapers as authentic Apache atrocity stories. But it was what Nalnish pulled from his own ceremonial bundle that sealed their fate and changed everything for Thomas and Aiyana. The war chief unwrapped a beautiful blanket, woven from the finest wool and decorated with intricate patterns in red, black, and white. The design told stories of mountains and rivers, of the eternal dance between earth and sky, of two peoples finding harmony despite their differences. "This is a wedding blanket," Nalnish announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "It was woven by my wife for our daughter, to be used when she chose a husband worthy of her spirit." Aiyana's eyes widened in surprise, and something that might have been hope. "Father, you have chosen daughter, and your choice has been tested by trial and truth." The war chief looked directly at Thomas. "You could have abandoned her when the pursuit grew dangerous. You could have blamed her for your troubles. Instead, you protected her, learned from her, and stood beside her when justice required courage." Thomas felt the weight of every eye upon him as Nalnish continued. "Among our people, when a woman's honor has been compromised, marriage restores balance, but when that marriage is freely chosen by hearts that have been tested, it becomes something more, a bridge between worlds." The wedding blanket seemed to glow in the morning sunlight, its patterns shifting and flowing like living things. Thomas understood that this was more than just a ceremonial covering. It was acceptance, recognition, and blessing, all woven into one sacred object. "Thomas McKenna," the war chief said formally, "my daughter has chosen you, and you have proven yourself worthy of that choice. Will you take her as your wife according to both our laws and yours?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the sacred pipe. Around them, Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers waited for an answer that would determine not just two peoples' future, but the possibility of peace between their peoples. Thomas looked at Aiyana, seeing in her eyes all the dreams they had shared during their desperate flight, all the hopes for a life that honored both their worlds. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the sacred ground, "with all my heart." Nalnish smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Thomas had seen from the formidable war chief. "Then let the blanket be spread." Kosin and Delshay, the brothers who had hunted them so relentlessly, now stepped forward to help arrange the wedding blanket on the ground. The symbolic act of former enemies creating the sacred space for marriage was not lost on anyone present. "According to the old ways," Nalnish explained as Thomas and Aiyana knelt together on the blanket, Marriage is not just between two people, but between two families, two ways of life. This blanket will cover you as you begin your journey together, protecting you from the storms that will come. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his hat in his hands. Chief Nalnish, I'm not sure about the legality. The marriage will be blessed by both our laws, the war chief assured him. Your territorial judge can perform your ceremony, and our medicine man will perform ours. But the choice has been made under the sacred pipe, witnessed by both our peoples. As Kochiska began the traditional Apache wedding chants, the ceremonial blanket seemed to embrace Thomas and Aiyana, wrapping them not just in wool and dye, but in the accumulated blessings of generations who had found love strong enough to bridge any divide. The Blake brothers sat in chains nearby, their crimes exposed, their influence ended. But their capture was secondary now to the greater victory. Two peoples choosing trust over suspicion, love over hatred, hope over the bitter legacy of war. Under the wedding blanket, ancient patterns told new stories of harmony, possible between any two hearts brave enough to write them. 6 months later, the McKenna ranch had become something neither Thomas nor Aiyana could have imagined when they first met at the sacred stream. The old boundaries between Apache and white communities had not disappeared, but they had begun to blur in ways that offered hope for a different kind of future. Thomas stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching Aiyana tend the garden she had planted behind the house. Apache medicinal herbs grew alongside traditional vegetables, and roses climbed trellises built with techniques learned from both cultures. The garden itself had become a symbol of what was possible when different ways of life enriched rather than replaced each other. In his hands, he held their most precious possession, a leather-bound journal they had begun keeping together, recording not just the daily events of ranch life, but the story of how two peoples might learn to live in harmony. The book was Aiyana's idea, born from her belief that their children and grandchildren would need to understand the struggles that had brought their parents together. The journal's pages chronicled small victories and larger hopes. There were accounts of Apache families trading peacefully at the ranch, their horses grazing beside Thomas's cattle, while negotiations proceeded with the patient dignity Aiyana had taught him to appreciate. There were stories of cavalry patrols stopping to water their horses and sharing meals with Apache hunters, the former enemies finding common ground in their love of the land and their desire to protect their families. Thomas, Aiyana called from the garden, her voice carrying the contentment that had replaced the desperate urgency of their first days together. Come see what's blooming. He set the journal carefully on the porch table and walked to where she knelt beside a section of particularly vigorous plants. The roses she had transplanted from her grandmother's garden were producing their second bloom of the season, their deep red petals the same color as the sacred cliffs where they had hidden from her brothers. Beautiful, he said, though he was looking at her rather than the flowers. She smiled, the expression that never failed to make his heart race despite the months they had been married. The land is healing, she said, gesturing toward the garden and the pastures beyond. When people tend it with love, instead of taking from it with violence, it responds with abundance. Lieutenant Morrison had become a regular visitor to the ranch, his official reports to Fort Aiyana now including detailed accounts of successful Apache cavalry cooperation. The Blake brothers had been tried and convicted, their execution serving as a warning to others who might profit from stirring racial hatred. More importantly, their exposure had led to a broader investigation that uncovered a network of criminals who had been using Apache raids as cover for their own thefts and murders. "What are you writing about today?" Aiyana asked, settling beside him on the porch as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. Thomas opened the journal to its latest entry, reading aloud. Today, Kosen brought his new son to the ranch for blessing. Kochiska performed the naming ceremony beside our stream, the same waters where our story began. The child will be called Thomas Who Bridges, in honor of the friendship between our families. Aiyana leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting on the journal's pages. "And what will you write about tomorrow?" "I thought I might write about the letter I received from my father's regiment. They want to commission a study of successful Apache cavalry cooperation, using our ranch as an example of what's possible. And I want to write about the dream I had last night, about our children playing in this garden, speaking both languages, learning both ways of life, never having to choose between the worlds that made them." The journal lay open between them, its blank pages waiting for stories yet to be written. In its margins, Aiyana had begun teaching Thomas to read and write Apache pictographs, while he helped her refine her English script. The book was becoming a bridge itself, between languages, between cultures, between the bitter past and the hopeful future they were building together. As the stars emerged overhead, they continued writing by lamplight, recording the daily miracles of a love that had transcended hatred, of communities learning to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies, of a land finding peace after too many years of war. Their shared journal would outlive them both, passing to children and grandchildren who would add their own stories to its pages. It would serve as proof that sometimes, in the vast desert of human conflict, two people brave enough to love across the boundaries others had built could create an oasis where all might find shelter, understanding, and hope for tomorrow.